Hi, my name is Michelle Back, and I'm an assistant professor of Spanish at George Mason University. I'm here today to talk about my article, Using Facebook Data to Analyze Learner Interaction During Study Abroad, which was published in Foreign Language Annals. I first became interested in study abroad when I began working with Professor Sally Magnan at the University of Wisconsin on study abroad data that she had collected in France. And one thing that struck me about the data that she and so many other study abroad researchers had collected was that the majority of it was, at the time, self-reported data. And what that means is that we ask students a certain amount of questions, such as, for example, uh, when did you use the language? How many days per week did you interact in the language? How many hours per day? What did you interact with family, your host family? Did you interact with non-native speakers in the target language, etc., etc.? And so we would give them these questions, and they would have to tell us when they were interacting in the target language and for what purposes. And while these types of survey methods have been extremely helpful for giving us a little bit more of a general picture of the trends of interaction in the target language while abroad, they don't really offer a very in-depth portrait of what's really happening, of the real-time interactions that are happening while abroad. And so this was a question that I was left with, and when I left Madison, I started to teach Portuguese, and I had a group of students that were planning to study abroad in Brazil. And I asked three of them if I could friend them on Facebook and learn a little bit more about how they were feeling about the study abroad program, their impressions, how they were adjusting to the situation. And three of them agreed to be my friend on Facebook. And I was able to follow them from a little bit before they left until a little bit after they returned. And so it was about 9 months total that I was looking at their interactions on Facebook. And what I found really surprised me. First of all, the three students that I followed closely were interacting in the target language on Facebook. And they were constructing new social networks. They were talking with new friends that they had met in Brazil on Facebook. And this was surprising to me because previous literature had talked about how students who were studying abroad often used social media as exclusively as a way to connect with family and friends back home. And while my students were doing this as well, they were also reaching out to new people and using Portuguese in this environment to have these interactions. And this was something that I was very excited about because I realized that I was able to access naturally occurring real-time interactions of my students, and I didn't have to be there in Brazil. And so without having to do a very time-consuming and costly ethnography study, I was able to at least get some aspect of their interactions in Brazil. And I was even able to track to a certain extent their acquisition of particular terms on Facebook. And so this is very exciting to me from a researcher perspective because I believe that this type of social media data, such as using Facebook, offers a lot of opportunities for researchers to study naturally occurring interaction in the target language, assuming that the students who are abroad are posting in the target language. And it really opens up a whole realm of possibilities of how to look at study abroad and to really see on a moment-to-moment basis how students are communicating. And I think that this also has important implications for language teachers as well. I think that so often, and also administrators of study abroad programs, because so often we think of social media as something that students do to relax, that they do it in their native language, and we don't think about the advantages, the possible advantages of using social media for activities such as study abroad or even in-class language learning. And so I think that a great future research would be to really look at how we can encourage students to use social media as a positive tool rather than possibly as a crutch that they lean on while they're abroad, which is obviously a problem that happens as well. And so what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is I'm just going to show you a couple of slides and take you through some of the charts that are in this article and just show you a little bit of my findings. And if you have any questions or you're interested in chatting more about this, you can contact me at mback@gmu.edu, and I'll post that email address on the end. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about my participants, and we'll start from left to right. Here we have Luisa. She is a student from Mexico who learned English as a second language and then proceeded to Portuguese when she was in college. And she was very excited about learning Portuguese and even became a Portuguese major at the university. Then we have Mariana, who is a Mexican American. She learned Spanish as a heritage language at age 17, and she was also very excited about going to Brazil. And lastly, we have Donna, who is a languages major. She actually learned Spanish herself. She was self-taught at age 17, and she also began learning Portuguese in college. And why I wanted to point this out to you is that all of these individuals had very different goals with respect to their study abroad experience. They had different career trajectories. They had different language learning experiences in the past. And I think it's important for us to recognize that even when we are looking at a group of study abroad students as a whole, there are many individual differences that will affect the way that these students acquire languages and interact, whether it's on Facebook or in real life. The first thing that I wanted to look at was how often each of these individuals was posting in Portuguese on Facebook. And what I found was, first of all, that all three of the individuals were using Portuguese on Facebook, and that was a pleasant bit of info for me. And also that both Mariana and Luisa had these huge spikes of activity in the 3 months rather that they were abroad. And what these two lines indicate is they're dividing the period between the before going abroad, while abroad, and after going abroad. And so what we saw with both Mariana and Luisa were a big spike in activity on Facebook in Portuguese. Donna's own interactions by comparison were fairly low and didn't really change much over the entire period. And so I found this interesting for both Mariana and Luisa because it meant that at least two of the individuals were interacting quite a bit on Facebook in Portuguese, and possibly that could have pointed to the fact that they were interacting in Portuguese in general quite a bit. And the other interesting thing to look at here is how it drops off so much after they return, and that's something I think that's a real concern for study abroad administrators and language instructors everywhere, is really trying to keep that language maintained even after they return from abroad. The other thing that I wanted to do in this article is really show some comparative data, looking at the Facebook data and comparing it to the self-reported data. And so what we have here is a chart, a very small chart, that has self-reported data on when the students thought that they were using Portuguese and whether it was a superficial or an extended conversation. And so that you can see that what we have are some hours per day, and basically they're about the same, and you don't see the real variety that you saw in the previous figure, where you could look at how often they were posting, whether there was increases in their posts or decreases. Whereas here we just have kind of a very general average hours per day that's not really going into the nuances of the interaction. And I'll talk a little bit about precisely those nuances in the next slide. So this slide just looks in a little bit more detail at one of Luisa's conversations on Facebook. And I found that when I wanted to look a little bit closer at what type of language that students were using when they were interacting in Portuguese, I used a close discourse analysis that took into account not only the content of the conversation, but also some extra linguistics symbols, such as, for example, the symbols that are very much more popularly used on Facebook, such as the emoticon here, the bate palmas, which means applauds, and so what she's doing here is she's doing a sort of narrating what she's doing in real life as she has this conversation. I also looked a lot at abbreviations. Well, this abbreviation VC, which stands for você, and it was a very common abbreviation with people that were quite proficient in computer-mediated communication in Portuguese. And we see that Luisa is using it and using it well. The other computer-mediated communication abbreviation was an RS, or variant RSRS, and that's short for risos, which means laughter. And so what I could see just from this little exchange with her friend was that Luisa was interacting in a very proficient way with her native-speaking Brazilian friend. She was able to use a variety of computer-mediated communication-related tools, and as well as other discursive tools such as humor and emoticons and a great deal of things. So this really showed that she was really acquiring these interactive techniques while she was abroad. And finally, another tool that I used to look at the Facebook data was this tool called Wordle, where you can basically paste a bunch of text, in this case all of my interactions, or all of my students' interactions rather, with on Facebook in Portuguese. And what the Wordle tool will do is it will give you essentially a graphic view of frequency. So the words that are biggest are the ones that are the most used in this Wordle. And so I'm using Luisa's Wordle as an example, and you can see that words such as parabéns, which means congratulations, saudades are very large, and so they were very frequently used. And also you can see again those computer-mediated terms VS and RSRS are also quite present. Slang terms such as ne, which is a short term for now or isn't that so, were also very frequent. And so just given this this Wordle, this helps to look at the frequency and exactly what words are being used by the students as they interact on Facebook. Again, something that's very difficult to do with self-reported data. So in conclusion, I hope that you have found this discussion interesting and informative, and I hope that you will read the article and get a little bit more detail of all of the things that I've mentioned very briefly here. And thank you very much again for listening, and I hope that you will be able to find some use for social media in your own research and teaching.